Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. I am Elana Stein Hain, and I am really excited to talk to you about responsibility today. Interestingly enough, the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Lamed Vav Amud Bet, talks about a really peculiar and, I think, inspiring form of responsibility, which is what happens if at the beginning of a process, I am negligent about something, and at the end of that process, something beyond my control causes damage. Am I liable or not? And the Gemara's example is, I am a shomeret. I am supposed to be watching over somebody's animal. Because of my pshia, because of my irresponsibility, the animal was able to leave the place where I was supposed to be watching it. And it ends up in a marsh. In that marsh, it dies of natural causes. So, on one hand, I wasn't negligent as a shomeret. I did let the animal go. On the other hand, it would have died if it was in the house anyway, meaning it died of old age or died of natural causes. So that's onus. I can't control that, right? So should I be liable or not? And that is the machloket on Lamed Vav Amud Bet. Interestingly enough, tchilתו בפשיעה וסופו באונס, as we call it, started off as negligence, ended up as a force beyond one's control, is a machloket between Rava and Abaye. But I actually don't think we should think of it as much as a machloket between Rava and Abaye in general, but actually a machloket about this particular case. In this particular case, could the animal have died sitting in the house where I was watching it? Sure. So Rava says, come on, my pshia, my negligence, it didn't make a difference for the onus that happened at the end. It didn't make the onus any more possible. It didn't make the onus any less possible. And Abaye seems to say, you know what? Even though I can't prove a clear connection between them, I'm not bothered by the fact that there isn't a clear connection between them. It's true, in the Gemara, it's brought up that maybe the atmosphere of the marsh killed it. But it seems like it's not necessarily the case that there needs to be a relationship, like a causal relationship between my negligence and the force that happened at the end. So for Rava and Abaye, it seems like we might actually just have two different explanations for the logic behind when we say, or the parameters for when we say, תחילתו בפשיעה, וסופו באונס, חייב, right? For Rava, there has to be a clear relationship between the pshia and the onus. The pshia has to have made the onus more possible. And for Abaye, that's not necessarily the case. It is possible that they are not connected, and yet. Now, this conversation is actually litigated in many, many places. There are a few cases in Bava Kama, there are a few cases in Bava Metzia. Interestingly enough, this is a question that runs through both the dinim, the laws of shomrim, of people who are watching things for other people, who are watching over things, guarding things for other people, because you can imagine, especially if you're a shomeret chinam, you're a person who's watching something for free. If there is a case of onus, if there's a case of something beyond your control, you are not responsible. But if there's a case of pshia, if you were a poshat, if you were negligent, then you would have to pay. So it's actually the perfect case for like a shomeret chinam, right? Somebody who's watching something for free. And it's also in the case of just regular nizikin, right? In the case of just regular damages, right? Like my kelev jumps off my roof. My kelev falls off my roof, right? And breaks stuff on its way down that belongs to somebody else. And it's like, that's a real case in Bava Kama. You may remember it, right? What was my kelev doing up on the roof, right? I should be worried that my kelev would jump off the roof, right? But I probably never thought that my kelev would fall off the roof. That's kind of onus, right? But maybe in a case like that, even Rava would say, I should be chayevet. Because the fact that I let my animal on the roof, which was my pshia, is what led to it being able to fall off the roof, which is onus, right? There's a little bit more of a relationship, not a little bit more, there's more of a relationship. The onus is machmat the pshia, the thing that's out of my control, the animal slipping off the roof, which I didn't expect, would never have happened if I hadn't been a poshat. But I want to look at another example in Bava Metzia, which God willing you'll get to. And it's always fun, like, to have that nostalgia when you get to that next case. You know, yeah, we talked about it, and then I remember back to this Gemara and Lamed Vav Amud Bet. It's like the learner's delight. So Bava Metzia Tzadi Gimel Amud Bet gives us another case of a shomer, right? Somebody who's supposed to be watching stuff. Now, in this case, it's somebody who's getting paid for that. It's a shepherd. So here's the case. Ro'eh shahaya ro'eh, somebody who's a shepherd, v'hinech edro, uva la'ir, and left their flock and came to the city. Let's say some wild animals come and attack and kill the flock. So what do? Do we say that that shepherd is chayav? Right? Now, I'm going to say it already in terms of pshia at the beginning, because why was this Ro'eh leaving, right? And onus at the end, like, come on, what am I going to do? Like, if a lion comes out of nowhere, could I have actually protected them from a lion? Like, that's onus. That's beyond my control. But the Gemara is not going to say it in those terms yet, right? First, the Gemara is going to say, Ein omrim ilu hayasham hayamatzil. We don't just assume that if the person had been there, they would have saved them. We don't just assume that the shepherd would have, this wouldn't have happened if the shepherd had been there. Ella, rather, umdinoto. What we do is we actually try to assess the shepherd. Im yachol hatzil chayav. If the shepherd would have been able to save the animals, let's say this shepherd is, I don't know, a former soldier, right? Like, knows how to deal with this. Let's say this shepherd is a hunter. Let's say this shepherd is someone who's been through examples like this before. Then the shepherd is liable, because if the shepherd could have been there, shepherd would have prevented it. He prevented it. Im lav, if the shepherd couldn't have prevented it, patur, they're exempt. Now, the Gemara says, wait. Tell me a little bit more about this story. My lav, da'al be'idna da'ile inshe. Is this a case where the shepherd, like, left when people, like, went to the city when people usually went to the city, right? Like, meaning, is this like, this is a break? Like, he was on break, so he was allowed to do this? So, the Gemara says, no. Da'al be'idna delo aili inshe. He actually went on a time when it wasn't actually his break. So the Gemara says, wait, slow. If this is the case, amai patur. Why is this person exempt, even if he couldn't have saved the animals? Tchilatto b'pshiya וסופו באונס chayav. We say that the negligence at the beginning of leaving the post when he shouldn't have left the post, even though at the end animals came and trampled and he couldn't have done anything about it, nonetheless, because of his pshia at the beginning, the onus at the end, he's still liable, right? Now, this is really interesting because it sounds like even if he couldn't have done anything to save the animals. So you tell me, is this a situation where his negligence is what ultimately led to the onus? Or because he never could have saved the animals anyway, we should say the negligence didn't lead to the onus. If he had been there and an Ari had come, he couldn't have done anything, right? And that's really the difference for us between Rava and Abaye, right? For Abaye, he doesn't care if the Ro'eh couldn't have prevented the onus. He cares about the pshia at the beginning no matter what. Whereas for Rava, he does care. And really only if the negligence is what allowed the onus to happen. In this case, namely, the Ro'eh could have saved the animals, only then will you say that that person is financially responsible. So it's interesting, the way that the Rishonim read and paskin based on this Gemara is really reflective of this question of, does there have to be a connection between the pshia and the onus? So the Rif, for example, in the Dapei HaRif, Daf Kaf Amud Aleph, in the back of Bava Metzia, says, the Shamina Mina, what we hear from this situation, where it started with negligence, even if the onus happened having nothing to do with the negligence. Because recall that in the last line that we just read, it seems to say that the ro'eh would be chayav even if he couldn't have saved the animals, which means he could have been standing there and an ari could have come out of nowhere and nothing would have changed. But nonetheless, chayav, still responsible. So the Rif says, guess whose opinion this is? Hahu meimra de Abaye v'Rabahu. This must be according to the school. This must be according to Abaye and Rabbah. This is not, Rava would not agree to this, right? So the Rif says, you're right. This is a case where there's no relationship. There's no causal relationship between the pshia of leaving your post when you're not supposed to and the onus of wild animals trampling, because you couldn't save them anyway. But nonetheless, for Rabbi, they still think you'd be chayav in that case. And we have to understand the logic, and we're going to get there. The Rambam, however, tells a different story. He goes with the beginning of the Gemara instead of the end. The Rambam in Hilchot Schirut, Perek Gimel, Halakha Chet, Ro'eh she'iniach edro uva la'ir, a shepherd that leaves their flock and comes to the city. Bein be'et she'derech haru'im likanes, uvein be'et she'en derech haru'im likanes, whether it's at a time when he's allowed to or not allowed to. Uvo ze'evim utrafo ari v'daras, right? And ze'evim came, I should probably say v'tarfu. I don't know why, I mean, I downloaded a Nikudot version, but uva'u ze'evim v'tarfu, I assume. Either way, so unless utrafo is talking about the Eder, all right, interesting grammar for another time, right? Wild animals came and trampled the flock. We don't say ilu hayasham hayamatzil. We don't say that if the person was there, we don't assume that if the person was there, they would save. Ela umdinato. You check, you assess the person. If the person could have done something to save by maybe getting other shepherds to help or, using sticks, who knows, chayav, then they're financially liable. V'imlav patur, right? And if not, they are not liable, because after all, there's no relationship between the onus and the pshia. V'im ena davar yadua, and if we don't know, chayav l'shalem. We said that they have to pay. But this is interesting. The Rambam really goes with the beginning of the Gemara, and the beginning of the Gemara seems to indicate we're actually looking for a causality between the pshia and the onus. Now, it's also interesting to think about, and you have to look at the Nosei Kelim on the Rambam, that the Rambam also says even if the ro'eh leaves at a time when you're allowed to leave your post, where it's not pshia. So that's interesting in and of itself, right? But that's maybe for another time, right? So we have these two opinions. Rava's side, there has to be a relationship between the onus and the pshia in order to be chayav. Abaye's side, there doesn't have to be a relationship between the onus and the pshia in order to be chayav. Let's start thinking about the logic behind this whole concept of tchiltho b'pshia, וסופו באונס chayav. Okay? So Rav Usher Weiss, who often will take a sugya like this, bring lots of different opinions, including of Achronim, and then give his own gloss. He does a really beautiful job of summarizing the positions of different, well, here specifically Rabbi Akiva Eger, but summarizing positions that offer logic behind this concept that you might say, תחילתו בפשיעה, וסופו באונס חייב. Right? So he says, first he says his opinion, and then he's going to say, the two opinions that he's rejected for the logic. Okay, but let's read his opinion, and then the two opinions that he's rejecting. We're going to talk about all three. Okay, he says, "V'hanir'eh ikar b'sugya gedola zo." Here's what I think is the principle in this big sugya. D'yesod dina de tchilato b'pshia chayav. The foundation of the law that if there was negligence at the beginning, that person is financially responsible. Hu mishum, it is because the al yedei hapshia b'tchilato, because committing that negligence at the beginning caused something. What did it cause? Because of it, haka ptur haones basof. The usual exemption of, well, something happened beyond my control, that goes away. Because of my negligence at the beginning, I lose my legal cover at the end. That's his understanding. And he's going to explain to us why in a minute, but just file that right here. Now, this is a little bit different from the usual explanations that are offered, and he's going to summarize those now as well. He says, Ve'ein hatam, I do not think that the reason is, which is code for, this is what other people think the reason is, da'kol nechshav pshia chada, that everything is considered one big negligence, that the onus is even considered one big negligence. So that's another logic that people offer. Oh, mishum de pshia rishona be'etzem mechayevet, or because the initial negligence is somehow at that moment already obligates the person, right? Almost like has a hold on their finances already from the beginning. He says, I don't think either of those are right. So I want to give us, what are our three explanations? So the usual explanations that are offered, and I mean by Rishonim, by Achronim, is that you can understand tchiltho b'pshia וסופו באונס in one of two ways. One way to understand it is to say, because of the negligence at the beginning, even the onus is actually basically considered pshia. And this whole process is one big pshia. Now, if that's going to be your logic, it makes a lot of sense that you would only make someone financially responsible if there really is a relationship between the onus and the pshia, right? If there really is, if my negligence actually did cause something that's beyond my control, but if not for my negligence, it wouldn't have happened. If I hadn't let my animal on the roof, it wouldn't have fallen off the roof, right? The logic works a little bit, it doesn't work as well, or maybe it doesn't work at all, if we're talking about a case where there's no relationship between the pshia and the onus. Because if there's no relationship, the animal would have died anyway. Then how are you telling me that even the onus is like partial pshia, right? You can't really, right? So that logic really works when there's a relationship between the two. And what it essentially tells you is, look, you set off a process in motion that eventually led to damage or death or whatever the situation is. And the process that you set off in motion was negligent on your part. And because that negligence actually caused an onus to be able to happen, we got to hold you responsible, right? So that's one logic that's in there. Another logic that's in there, which quite frankly works really well with Abaye, where you don't have to have a relationship between the onus and the pshia, is that at the moment of your pshia, at the beginning of the moment of your negligence, even though nothing happened, the animal didn't fall off the roof yet, the animal didn't die yet, no wild animals came and trampled it yet. From the moment of the pshia, from the moment of your negligence, there's already basically a hold on your finances. Like you're already considered a poshat. You're already bad news, right? So the onus that happens later, it's just, you didn't fix the fact that you're already considered a poshat by returning the item, right? You could have fixed it by returning the item, but you've been a poshat all along, right? But you didn't return the item, so you're still a poshat, and that's it. Even though the item, the animal, whatever it is, died of onus, right? So it's kind of interesting, almost like, one of them is a little bit about, the process itself is a process of pshia, and the other one is a little bit about like you yourself have become a poshat, right? Which maybe works a little bit better in the shomrim context, because in the shomrim context, you actually have like an identity and a status, and a little bit less good when we're just talking about things getting, trampled in the street. That has nothing to do with you being like just nizik and regular. But suffice it to say, a logic like this second logic of I became a poshat the minute I did pshia, and the only way I can get out of it is by returning the object whole. or by not having that object or animal get hurt or damaged, that really explains Abaye's logic, right? Because like it doesn't matter if there's a relationship between the onus and the pshia. What matters that is I'm a poshat from the beginning, and I can't redeem myself because I don't have anything to return, or I can't redeem myself because this stuff is already broken, right? So it's kind of interesting, those two logics. But Rabbi Weiss doesn't like those two logics because, I mean, a few reasons why he doesn't like those two logics. I mean, one is like, what do you mean you're going to consider me a poshat already? Nothing happened yet. Meaning I understand I did pshia, but there's nothing happened to the item yet. You can't, right? Like, what are you doing here, right? And the other is sort of like, how could you, like, onus is onus. Like, it is onus. It's not pshia. So you can't say because I was poshat at the beginning, even the onus is like one big pshia from the beginning. It's not. It's onus. That's what it is. And so he comes up with this third explanation, which I think is really thoughtful of, no, it's what the pshia does at the beginning, the negligence does at the beginning, is it doesn't make you a poshat, and it doesn't turn the onus into pshia. What it does is it removes a legal protection from you, right? Later, your legal protection would have been, onus rachamana patre. The Torah doesn't punish people, doesn't penalize people for onus, right? But you don't have that cover anymore. And so he says it like this. He says, I think the reason is because there was a pshia that happened, because there was negligence at the beginning, the fact of something being beyond your control at the end doesn't exempt you. And here's how I want to explain this. Because the logic of the Torah does not prosecute people for things that are beyond their control. The logic of it is humishum, it's because of the following. My havale lamevad. What could I have done? Right? That's why the Torah says, somebody who something happens beyond their control, whether it's a literal case of ones, meaning a literal case of a person who's raped, or it is something else beyond your control. Why? Because my havale lamevad, what could they have done? So he says, the im kain, and if that's the case, that's the logic behind usually letting somebody off the hook because of something they couldn't control. Hashta, now in this situation, shepasha, when the person was negligent, Yiv Shalom Markvar, they can't say anymore, my havali lamevad. What should I have done? Right? Meaning, at some point in the process, there was something that you could have done. Right? So it's interesting, you just don't have that cover in general. Now, does this also still only work if the onus is somehow related to the pshia, like in a causal way? It feels that way to me, right? Like it seems that way to me, where you say like, what could I have done? It's like, what do you mean? You could have made sure that your animal didn't go on the roof. Like that's, right? So it makes a lot of logical sense. And then he continues, and there's, really interesting, discussion over there. And maybe I'll try to link to it if I can link to it online. I want to end with a really interesting halakha l'maaseh. I want to end with a case, or really maaseh shahaya, a case that happened that was adjudicated. Actually, I should say, a case that happened, and it was adjudicated. You can find it online, and I link to it in the source sheet, where a family hired a moving company, and the moving company, they did a pshia because they took more weight than they should have in the truck, okay? But what you would have thought would have happened, which is, I don't know, you get into some accident, maybe the stuff breaks down and it's late, something that would have happened from, having too much stuff in the truck. That's not actually what happened. Instead, what happened was there was some sort of implosion, and the engine caught on fire. And what happened was a fire was started and all the stuff got ruined. And so the question is, does this company have to pay for all the stuff, right? That was burnt, essentially. So, and they add a little thing. Apparently, there wasn't enough insurance on it, right? There wasn't insurance. So we actually need to get money from somebody to pay for these people's stuff that has been burnt. It's a great case. I mean, it's a terrible case, but it's a great case of tchilато b'pshiya וסופו באונס, right? You shouldn't be taking 3 tons on your truck if you're only allowed to take 2 tons on your truck, because it could lead to bad things. Now, nobody thought it was going to lead to a fire, right? Nobody thought it was going to lead to a fire, but that is what happened, right? And that's the onus. And so it's interesting the way that they paskin. Essentially, first of all, they rule it as a תחילתו בפשיעה וסופו באונס, right? And what they say is, and this is on the basis of Tosfot in Bava Kama Kaf Gimel Amud Aleph, that תחילתו בפשיעה וסופו באונס, we're going to say you're chayav, you're financially responsible, but you are only financially responsible for what we could have foreseen based on the pshia. You are not financially responsible for all the damage that happened from the fire. And here is sort of the concrete nafkamina, that they loaded it up, it was too heavy. Maybe they were worried about some sort of accident and some things being damaged. But in the fire, everything got damaged. Like books got damaged, right? It's not just, vases shattered, which could have happened in an accident, but there was smoke and, things caught on fire, which is something that probably in an accident, things like books, nothing would have happened to them. Now, I don't know if this made like such a meaningful dent, the fact that this moving company only had to pay for what they could have envisioned being damaged in an accident and not what they would have envisioned being damaged in a fire. But I presume it did save them some money. And I think it really is interesting because it adds a layer to the conversation of תחילתו בפשיעה וסופו באונס, right? Yes, it's true. We are holding you responsible for your negligence, but we are holding you responsible specifically for your negligence, right? Your negligence could have been valued at a certain amount of damage that it would have caused. This that happened is more than that. It's interesting. I would basically, ask people to put that in the hopper, like in your mental filter, when you're thinking about the 3 reasons that we heard iterated by Rav Asher Weiss, right? If the logic of תחילתו בפשיעה וסופו באונס chayav is because at the beginning you're already a posher or poshat, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like you only pay based on what you're posher or poshat for, because like that's the symbolic lien on your assets. If the onus turns the whole thing into pshia, right, then I don't think it would make much sense to say, oh, you only pay for what we could have foreseen based on the pshia. I think the onus actually should color how much you pay. And this third idea that Rav Weiss offered, that from the time of the pshia, you no longer have the ptur of onus because there is something that you could have done. I also think that this perspective wouldn't hold water, right? But it's interesting to consider the different logics, almost where in the process do you become chayevet, right? So I hope that this has been an exercise in trying to understand what I think is a very morally aspirational discussion, because on the one hand, you don't want to overtax society by making people financially responsible for things that they shouldn't be responsible for. But in this case, we're trying to say you don't want to let people get away with pshia, right? So it's true, Abaye's version of chayav is more expansive than Rava's, because it's even in a case where the pshia didn't lead to the onus. But you could argue that Rava's approach, that it's only when the pshia leads to the onus, it's sort of striking a really important balance. And this last example with the truck, with the moving truck, even if you might not agree with the logic of it, it's also trying to strike some sort of balance and recognize that there was both pshia and onus. But again, not sure I would have ruled the same way. Thanks for joining, everybody. Looking forward to the next one.